Hi, I'm Alex. Several months ago, in search of a hardware-based solution for production, I decided to give MPC standalone a chance. Then this was after many years with Logic and other DAWs. I'm still trying to make it work, but I think the current setup I've arrived at is actually pretty good. Today, we're getting into some details of how I do audio routing with the Behringer WING rack and MPC OS 3.5 in standalone mode on the MPC X SE and other current-gen MPC devices. So, if you're into the Wing or MPC, or maybe unsure if or how these devices fit into your studio's workflow, or you've hit a wall with the MPC's limits, hopefully you're in the right place. My setup is all about versatility, from singer-songwriter sessions to capturing live multi-track performances. Here's what I'm going for. One setup that not just records ideas, but handles complete tracks and live multi-track recording sessions. I'm going to show how to move past MPC's built-in limits and why an external audio interface like Wing is key to making this work. A lot of this talk probably applies to MPC 2 as well, but I'm fully on 3 at this point, and I'm not looking back. MPC 3 is trying to be a real DAW, God bless its heart. But let's talk about the real-world limits of MPC, because there's plenty. None of the current MPC lineup have enough built-in I/O for lots of instruments or complex routing. In a live jam session, MPC simply can't record all the tracks at once. I think it can only record like 1 or 2 tracks at a time. Each track can record up to 5 total minutes of audio. It's kind of barely enough for a song, let alone a live set. No, I think that's 5 total minutes of recording data, not including any duration where the track isn't actively being used. So it's going to be fine for the structure of like a normal modern song, but it's problematic for long takes. You're limited to 8 stereo audio tracks total, with no real workarounds. And please don't at me with MIDI tracks or sample pad hacks. That doesn't include other types of tracks like plugins and MIDI and CV, etc. You can have a whole bunch of those. Current gen MPC hardware just can't handle audio I/O on the same scale as like a modern desktop or laptop. So my expectations are in line with that, and it hasn't stopped me from doing what I want to do. So on MPC with an audio interface, you get up to 32 ins and outs, and the MPC can process them all with inserts and real-time production features, just like a real DAW. This is flavor country. This is where MPC really lives up to its potential. The Wing is both a mixer and a heavy-lifting USB audio interface. I'm using the Behringer WING rack, but I think all the models have similar capabilities. The Wing can send and receive 48 I/O channels over USB, of which MPC can only see and use 32. For me, that's fine. For multitrack, it can record up to 64 channels, but MPC, again, can only send up to 32 tracks, 32 channels. So that gives us about 90 minutes of recording time on a 32 gig SD card, which they claim is the limit that the Wing can support. We're talking about it's still a 32-bit OS, so the disk size and the file size that it produces have that 32-bit limitation. But yeah, at first I tried to put a really big card in there, and that didn't work. So it has massive DSP processing capability, like compression, EQ, amp modeling, effects, inserts, real-time, at the cost of practically 0 latency. And this device has more I/O and flexibility than my little studio here is probably ever going to need. Plug everything into the Wing. I use a Stage Connect digital snake and Wing's local analog inputs, of which there's a lot, there's like 40. I also use an analog snake from across the room for a clean run to the Wing. And all of these sources appear as sources in the Wing's UI when you're setting stuff up. On the Wing side, these sources show up as like local in, and stage connect. And then there's some other coming in over from USB from the MPC that I'll talk about later. One thing to wrap your head around that took me a little bit to change gears, the language flips on one side. So what MPC calls an output, Wing calls an input, and vice versa. So also when you're setting stuff up on the Wing, conceptually I think of setting stuff up in terms of the flow that it follows. So like from start to end of your signal chain. But when you go into the Wing UI, I find that a lot of these associations are dealt with in a reverse mapping kind of way, which threw me off at first. But I think once you get used to it, it's kind of powerful. So the signal path looks like your sources, where you plug stuff in at the tap. Channels, which is like your mixer channels, your mixer lanes that you are like routing those sources to. User signals, which are like, took me a minute to understand that, but they're kind of like a hook for getting your stuff out after post-processing. So you've got user signals, you've got like a USB audio output group, which is all the output going out over the wire over USB. This is what feeds the MPC inputs. At that point, the signal has left the Wing and it's gone over to the MPC. So over on the MPC, you've got your MPC tracks that you set up. Up to 8 stereo tracks, up to 8 stereo audio tracks, I should say, on the MPC. And each audio track can get its own output channel, up to like 32, and this is the point where Wing's USB audio output group becomes MPC's input channels. So whatever you set up over there, you just kind of mirror that setup over here. So once you've defined which audio tracks use which outputs over on the MPC side, so the MPC does what it does during your performance, applies inserts, fader levels, etc., and sends that signal back out over USB, back to the Wing for a second pass. And the signal leaves the MPC, goes back over to the Wing, and over on the Wing, that signal shows up as Wing's USB audio source group, and as opposed to the USB audio output group, which left the device earlier. So now the signal's back as the USB audio source group. Those get routed back to more channels, like even more channels, more sliders, more faders, and stuff. You can afford it because the Behringer Wing has enough to handle the MPC. And these are like post channels, like output channels. The earlier channels are like input channels. These are like output channels from the MPC's perspective anyway. And we have flipped back. MPC's output channels are audio source group, I guess is my point. And once those inputs have been assigned to the channels themselves can get hooked into the main bus. There's a special little place in the UI for that. You just click which main buses you want to send. The Behringer Wing has 4 stereo outs, and I'm routing the signal to all 4 of them using each output for a different purpose, like monitoring, external recorder, etc. And yeah, as I said, the audio passes through the Wing twice, but latency hasn't really been a concern. The workflow for setting this up looks like defining all of your sources, your local inputs and your stage connect inputs, and your MPC returns, even though that's kind of a later step. You can assign your Wing channels to the sources. That's the reverse mapping I talked about. You route every channel through a user signal for your DSP. And The reason that we do that is otherwise, if you just route the input directly to the output, you're going to get what's on the tap going directly to the output, and none of the inserts or DSP processing that occur on the wing are going to be reflected in that output signal. You're just kind of like bypassing it. So by creating a user signal for every single one of those sources, you can hook that user signal into the outputs. Yeah, so you use the DSP on the Behringer WING for like input pre-processing. At least that's what I do. Gain, compression, like amp sim. But I save the wildest stuff for over on the MPC, where I'm going to be doing the live performance. And when I'm doing a live performance, I generally, beyond touching the record button over on the wing side, I don't touch it. And I don't think that UI really lends itself well to a live performance anyway. So from the user signals, those are routed back to the USB audio output group, as I said before, which show up on the MPC as the inputs, the input channels. And over on the MPC, I set up the tracks, I assign the I/O, I keep in mind that 8 stereo track limit. And over on the MPC also, once I've initially got this stuff set up, I don't do this for every project. I save it as the default project. So every time the MPC gets turned on, it's just got these settings ready to go. Those MPC outputs come back to the wing as the USB audio source group, and I assign those to the main bus for monitoring or recording. And that's pretty much the whole flow. In the past, I've used separate input and output mixers in my studio, but the wing can be both. Now, the 8-track limit isn't a deal breaker for most of my use cases. It forces me to be creative, submix, assign buses, bounce tracks, whatever fits the session, and I use the wing for input preprocessing, dial in the sound before it hits the MPC. The MPC handles all the heavy lifting for creative production, effects, automation, inserts, the stuff you want to perform and tweak in real time. And it can send as many as 32 audio channels back over to the wing, where I can do stereo monitoring and multi-track recording. So here's how it all comes together for me. For production work, the MPC stands on its own full-featured DAW-style workflow. But for longer form or live sessions, the wing records all 32 MPC outputs. And as I said, that's up to 90 minutes per 32 gigabyte card. Afterwards, it's easy to just take those tracks into whatever DAW you use and mix it, edit it, finish it, remix it. And I think this is also an awesome way to potentially share your work with other artists and engineers for remixing. Combining the MPC and the wing is using both pieces of gear to their full potential. You get a full-on production studio or live rig, or both, by following something like the workflow I've laid out here. So if you have a modest setup right now and you want to push it further, this is one possible direction you could take it. If you have questions or comments about this little talk, please leave them in the comments. Thank you for listening.